Final Fantasy VIII prevails as one of the weirdest, most experimental and most unique entries to the Final Fantasy series. The middle child of the PlayStation 1 trifecta, Final Fantasy VIII rode the wave of goodwill and brand recognition that had built off the previous games, and in particular the success of Final Fantasy VII, which was the evolutionary pivot into the realms of 5th generation consoles and 3D, introducing the games to a whole new audience. And yet, such was Final Fantasy VIII's experimental nature, its departure from mechanistic and structural norms within the framework of JRPGs, it is arguably the first Final Fantasy game to have created a real conflict of opinion among players of the games. It is a densely layered, often absurdist story where one must buy the ticket and take the ride, get on board with the escalating stream of increasingly insane scenarios, taking us swiftly from a standard school day to assassinating a head of state in the first few hours alone. Indeed, Final Fantasy VIII proved for many players ultimately to be a step too removed from their expectations. On the one hand, some audiences may have arrived to the series with Final Fantasy VII and wanted something that was very similar to that title. On the other hand, we have those who were veteran players from the SNES days and perhaps wanted something more along pseudo-medieval Hironobu Sakaguchi type games, which is in no small part why Final Fantasy IX, which followed FF8, earned such renown upon its release. So, looked at this way, we have Final Fantasy VII, which was the innovative game changer for the PlayStation 1. We have Final Fantasy IX, which was the bookend and the nostalgic nod back to an earlier era. And then we have Final Fantasy VIII, which is this weird middle child that sits neither here nor there with the expectations or the conventions of the series so far. Now, that being said, it's interesting to consider Final Fantasy VIII through the passage of time and how it's viewed today, because I do feel like an appreciation towards it has grown, or at least become more vocal in recent years. Indeed, I started this YouTube channel just over 10 years ago, essentially to make a video essay advocating for Final Fantasy VIII, at a time when it was largely being criticised in forums and in other YouTube videos, and it was because of that, and because it's unabashedly my favourite game, that I wanted to respond to that. In recent years, however, Final Fantasy VIII is not without its vocal critics still, which it will always have, but there has been a softening in popular discourse around it, I think, a change in opinion for some, and an emboldened desire to vocalise for others, perhaps, where we have everyone from Final Fantasy darling Ben Starr to the director of the breakout RPG Expedition 33, to some quite significant, YouTube channels and publications now advocating and vocally stating how much they admire this game. And indeed, while the historic perception of Final Fantasy VIII as a black sheep of the series is starting to get shaken off, or at least embraced, it seems bizarrely that the main obstacle to a mainstream acceptance of the game in recent years is the developer Square Enix itself. And for example, if we consider the fanfare around the 25th anniversaries of both Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy IX, which were met with several social media posts, anniversary merchandise, and commemorative artwork, and so on, it seems only to have amplified the comparative silence and lack of celebration around Final Fantasy VIII's 25th anniversary, for which there was no dedicated merchandise drops or even really an acknowledgement in newsletters or media posts. And indeed, it was noted by some on social media that third-party media outlets and content creators seemed to be celebrating Final Fantasy VIII more than the creators themselves, which is once again a bizarre scenario if you consider the fanfare and the cool anniversary logos and stuff like that was given to the other two PS1 titles. And as I say, that the closest personnel to Square Enix that we really have vocally celebrating Final Fantasy VIII is guys like Ben Starr. So it's quite a bizarre scenario. I think it's largely resulted from the accumulative and historic harshness towards the game, and I think it's given senior staff at Square Enix a real aversion to really putting any time, effort or promotional capital into it. So that's a broad strokes look at the perception of Final Fantasy VIII then and now, which we'll pick up on throughout this episode, and a bit of context perhaps for the unique aspects of the game that we'll be covering here that have collectively created this mixed love it or hate it reception, and arguably made it the first truly divisive title for the Final Fantasy fanbase. So before jumping into cover Final Fantasy VIII proper, I'll cover briefly the production and personnel. Final Fantasy VIII was developed in a peculiar time and place at Squaresoft. The company was arguably at its creative and commercial peak, riding high off this successful pivot into the 3D era and onto the Sony PlayStation that came with Final Fantasy VII. Their micro studio production model was also seeing them consistently releasing unique and varied titles, whether that's Xenogears, Parasite Eve, Brave Fencer Musashi, and as a publisher, they were equally putting out unique titles like Bushido Blade, Urgite, God Bless the Ring, and that sort of thing. So very interesting time for Squaresoft, really a high point creatively. And while the method of having autonomous in-house studio teams innovating games, creating their own properties, creating their own proprietary systems for these respective games, that was obviously quite a expensive production model. At least in retrospect, I think we can see how it was also a very creative one, constantly creating and innovating. So it was a great time for the company, and it's why so many people look back on the output of the late 90s so fondly. During this period, and what also had a direct impact on Final Fantasy VIII's production, was the fact series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi had shifted focus onto the production of Square's newfound cinematic endeavour, which was Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. And this resulted in a certain autonomy for Final Fantasy VIII's production team, which was helmed by Yoshinori Kitase, but also on the other hand, it assumed a certain sense of urgency for Final Fantasy VIII's success, owing to the financial risk that Square's expensive business model was already kind of taking, and now it was mounted additionally with the investment in motion picture as well. So there's the context. Squaresoft riding high, very popular, putting out a lot of successful titles, but also owing to the overheads of innovating and producing things the way they did. Final Fantasy as the flagship had a lot of onus put on it to succeed. Now, I've talked in the past about individual team members at Square and how there's generally a very collaborative ethos on the Final Fantasy games that had been instilled by Sakaguchi himself through the early 1990s. That being said, each game does come with a certain weight towards some personnel over others, and since about Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy VI, Yoshinori Kitase had increasingly taken up the reins of scenario design and directing, with Final Fantasy VIII arguably being what we'd call the most Kitase-esque of the Final Fantasy games at this time. And as has been discussed in previous episodes, Sakaguchi viewed Kitase as someone who would carry the torch of the Final Fantasy brand in the future. So there was a lot of trust and a lot of goodwill there in Kitase kind of picking up and running with Final Fantasy VIII. So with regards to these Kitase-isms, we can look to certain aspects of the game and see where there are some clear elements that tend to recur in Kitase's input. I think the inclusion of Gilgamesh is a big one. The inclusion of an odd couple comedy duo in Biggs and Wedge. The Star Wars references there too. And these little elements that, in his more prominent writing roles since Final Fantasy V, have tended to appear in collaboration with the wider team from Kitase. Joining Kitase in the production of FF8, we had notable Square staff including Nobu Uematsu for the music, Kazushige Nojima supporting with narrative and scenario design, Yusuke Naora and Tetsuya Nomura in art direction and character design, Hiroyuki Ito supporting Kitase in system design. So some real rising stars and stalwart veterans of the company here that by this point in their careers had really earned their stripes through the successful production of either Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII. In keeping with Sakaguchi's collaborative ethos, this leading team built out the story together with their designs, themes and scenarios being conjured, recycled or passed around to come up with something that was cohesive and new. A great example of this is how Nomura and Nojima tend to work together to build out characters and backstories, and an early example of how Nomura would toss a grenade for Nojima to write around was the inclusion of Squall Leonhardt's Scar. And much like he did later with Komari Ronso's Broken Horn in Final Fantasy X, the design came first, and Nomura would pass it over to Nojima and say, come up with a backstory for why this guy has a scar. A very interesting way to collaborate, I think, and it's interesting how ideas and scenarios can spring out of this, because in the case of Squall's Scar, this evolved into a really interesting symbolism between Squall and Cypher, this duality of scars, and the opening FMV sequence where they're sparring and bits like that. In other areas of design, however, they were recycled from earlier concepts. So we have Sorceress Edea and the characters of Raijin and Fujin, for example, and they were dusted off from being abandoned in Final Fantasy VII's production and redeployed as slightly more prominent characters in Final Fantasy VIII. For Katase in particular, as a director he sat across the broader project, but he did work closely with Hiroyuki Ito in building Final Fantasy VIII's unique battle system, and this had to synchronise with the unique setting and story, this world of paramagic and sorceresses, which in turn itself entered into this feedback loop of design and story. And for example, the reason legacy summons like Rama, the lightning god, were switched out for the bird-like Quetzalcoatl and more animalistic deities like that is because Tetsuya Nomura couldn't envision a wizened old god figure needing to level up as per Final Fantasy VIII's summon mechanics. So it became a bit more Pokemon, collect all these creatures and nurture them and level them, rather than these figurative gods that we have in other games, with notable exceptions being Siren and Odin. But of course Odin, we can't level him and learn abilities from him, he's sort of like an autonomous being owing to that. A final brief note on production is Hironobu Sakaguchi's one key suggestion during development, which is that the game is about love, and I do contest this a little bit. I think it's more about time and living authentically in the time that's given to us, but we'll come to that when we cover themes. But I think his suggestion nonetheless helped elevate what was already a story focused on two key characters above an ensemble party, and it really emphasised this high school love at first sight sort of vibe that Final Fantasy VIII really jumps off from. So really top level view there, how we can see that Final Fantasy VIII was this melting pot of ideas forged from a team of Squaresoft heavyweights that were really pushing the calibre of storytelling, system design and graphical fidelity at this point in time, having built that strong foundation on the PlayStation 1 with Final Fantasy VII. Looking now to the setting, the art direction and the design of Final Fantasy VIII, this is really interesting to consider because on the one hand, Final Fantasy VIII can be lumped in with both Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy IX in some ways. They mark a particular time and place in the series' evolution, this unique high watermark of Final Fantasy's design, where we'd shaken off the tile set top-down pixel graphics of the SNES era, and this has been switched out for lush pre-rendered painted backgrounds, minified overworld maps, and polygonal characters. And it was this brief interlude before the games shifted more thoroughly into 3D environment design from Final Fantasy X onwards. That being said, Final Fantasy VIII still took quite a novel approach to design, and far from being a cosmetic veneer over which the story takes place, everything from the tone, the colour palettes, the environments, was purposely designed to support this world and setting and distinguish this game from its peers. And I relate back to Final Fantasy VII here because while this game was immensely successful, and it would have perhaps been quite tempting to create a carbon copy of that game, Katase and his team very consciously wanted to move away from the design of Final Fantasy VII and the games that came previously. So the bleak dystopian setting of Final Fantasy VII and the medieval tech vibes of prior titles have been switched out entirely for a glossy futurism. Scenic locations like Balamb Garden, Delling City and Dole convey a more utopian vision of the future where old meets new, a certain affluent progression and liberty as compared to the downtrodden serfdoms of Junon, Midgar and Corel. A modern transcontinental train service links up the world and is conspicuously visible on the overworld. Technology and commerce is widespread, and even those on the fringes of the civilized world, like the Shumi, are decidedly advanced in their social amenities. The decision to embrace a futuristic aesthetic even inches into the user interfaces of the game, where the traditionally blue hue of the menu screens has been exchanged for this grey, glossy metallic sheen, echoing perhaps the Y2K aesthetic zeitgeist of the time, and in combination with the natural organic shapes and colours of Balamb Garden and places like that, it in some ways I think anticipated the organic, naturalistic Frutiger Aero aesthetic that would define the next decade of digital design in the 2000s. Indeed, there is a coziness to the design of Final Fantasy VIII that sheds entirely this sense of doom and gloom of the previous game. And while the narrative inclusion of Galbadia explores a sinister expansionism parallel to the Shinra, it does so without the overt decay of societies and the natural world around it. Likewise, gone are the clear and present existential threats that other Final Fantasy games tend to have, whether that's debilitating blights or meteor raining from the sky or sin creatures or mist. There's no such clear and present danger as these other titles. And while yes, there is technically an extinction level event present in the form of the Lunar Cry, it's not nearly so immediate or palpable or constant in the game as these other examples are. So for example, where sin is just always present in Spira, aside from this brief calm, constantly threatening wholesale destruction, and it's tangibly prevented mankind from evolving beyond these coastal shantytowns. Final Fantasy VIII, by contrast, obviously has a clear affluence and progression to its society, its cities, and its towns. So in all, Final Fantasy VIII chose for its setting an advanced world that is the apex of its civilization. Regal, antiquated cities chime alongside modern technology, and Uematsu's musical score accompanies this setting in a very optimistic way, whether it's the Blue Fields overworld tune or Dance of the Baalam Fish. These each attest to an overwhelmingly positive vibe. That again is in stark contrast to the preceding title, where tunes like the Great Northern Cave or the Sandy Badlands, the overworld theme, they are steeped in this certain melancholy of Final Fantasy VII's world. In keeping with design, the decision to move towards figurative realism was also a huge step for the Final Fantasy series, and is today somewhat overlooked, I think, owing to Final Fantasy IX returning to a more abstracted design style, and then Final Fantasy X reintroducing figurative design with a renewed graphical and cinematic fidelity, owing to the advances of the PS2. So the fact that characters in the world were realistically proportioned, the fact that our party members follow us around in the playable environment in a stab at a realistic Fellowship adventure, it really showed the ambition and the experimentation at work in Final Fantasy VIII. And whether it's the fur on Squall's jacket being designed as a challenge to render in FMVs, or the sheer number of 800 plus pre-rendered background scenes, Final Fantasy VIII really pushed the envelope for what was possible on the PlayStation 1. And indeed, we need only look at Nomura's character designs for Final Fantasy VIII that, in a far cry from Kazuka Shibuya's wonderful chibi artwork for the earlier games, and even Nomura's manga-inflected Final Fantasy VII characters, it shows how this title was embracing a real attempt at realism and plausible, tangible characters that was something entirely new for the series compared to everything that had come before. So moving from setting and art direction to some broader points on design, FF8 was a bold step towards doing things differently in almost every way by removing aesthetic set pieces that had once been constant in the Final Fantasy games to this point. So Moogles were all but removed from the game in favour of Moonbars, with only Minimog as a historic nod. Likewise, Chocobos were reduced down to optional forest locations, and rather than being an early introduction to transport, which they traditionally were, they can basically be ignored for this entire game if the player chooses. And likewise, finally, crystals, as a historic staple of the Final Fantasy games, they were diminished in narrative importance, right down to featuring only as the crystal pillar which draws monsters down to Earth for the Lunar Cry. So what this does in many ways is liberate the texture and storytelling of Final Fantasy VIII from its traditions, where even the traditional periodic use of dungeon crawls to break up the pace of the games is removed almost entirely, and we only have the Fire Cave, the Delling City sewers, and the D-District prison really being analogous to a dungeon experience. Maybe the Deep Sea Research Centre and Central Ruins as well. And so what we have instead is a mission-based game within a consistently escalating story that aligns to the status of our heroes as mercenaries taking jobs on behalf of Garden. Another observation of setting design in FF8 is the comparative freedom for the player. Our introduction to the world map comes within the first 15 minutes of the game, and we likewise acquire the largely free-roaming vehicle of Garden pretty early in the game as well. So indeed, where other Final Fantasy games like FF7 tightly funnel us by topography up until we receive the Highwind, Final Fantasy VIII is much more of a sandbox of self-determined player navigation. And what's more is the periodic use of vague directions given to the player, where we have to basically figure things out for ourselves. So we have Quistis telling us to head east to the Fire Cave, which is admittedly one of only 3 locations on Balam. Or later, we have characters vaguely remembering a lighthouse by the sea for Adia's orphanage, which we need to go and find. So the onus was very much on the player to explore and locate things, rather than running along this strategically designed continent to take us to the next town. So, taking these observations of setting and design, we can see how Final Fantasy VIII might have rubbed some people the wrong way with its approach, particularly veterans of the series. It didn't even attempt to integrate tried and true idiosyncrasies of Final Fantasy into the game, with perhaps only the subtle but important symbolism of sorceresses and self-described sorceresses knights nodding slightly to this knights and mages style of earlier Final Fantasy games. And even this is turned on its head, since magic is a very scarce and particular resource in the game that is held by sorceresses and guardian forces, which in turn ties into junctioning and paramagic and all of these unique bizarre things that we'll take a look at. Now, it could make sense to segue into themes and story here, since so much of it interrelates and responds to the approach to setting and art direction, right from the opening moments of the game. But I would like to cover, if briefly now, the various aspects of system design in Final Fantasy VIII, since it too is closely interconnected with the world and setting. And while approaches to mechanics, leveling and so on is often up for debate and subjectively received by players, depending on their preferences, one can rarely argue that design decisions in Final Fantasy games are random or exist within a vacuum within their particular world. What I mean by this is that while systems in Final Fantasy VIII are often criticised, they also make sense within the laws and context of the world they are in, just as materia slots make sense for the crystallised magic-imbued Mako of Final Fantasy VII, the license boards make sense for the bureaucratic imperial world of Final Fantasy XII, so too does the junction system make sense for a world in which magic cannot be naturally utilised by humans, excusing sorceresses, and it is only through technological advancement that paramagic can be superficially channeled by humans, through the conduit of sentient beings known as guardian forces. So this makes for a coherent, if dubiously received, system of junctioning and drawing, where firstly, magic cannot be used by characters unless a guardian force is equipped to them, and secondly, rather than humans being imbued with magic and thus having their own system of mana points or MP, magic, much like items, is a finite, stocked resource that must be drawn from enemies or locations in the world. Magic can also uniquely be junctioned to boost characters' stats if we train our summons in certain abilities, and so Final Fantasy VIII's ability system resides in this unique balance between stocking magic to augment abilities and using magic in battle. This has often been criticised, with dissenters citing Final Fantasy VIII as a game that discourages the use of magic, and they prefer older systems and set character classes and things like that. And this is an argument that I do appreciate, but at the same time I always saw Final Fantasy VIII's junction system as a form of pseudo-character class building and customization, and for example, building out Squall as a melee tank by junctioning Ultima to his strength is fine, because he's a character that you're never going to use as a spellcaster anyway. Conversely, junctioning Ultima or some innocuous spell to Selphie's magic as a pseudo-white mage, this ensures that all of her healing and support abilities are strong, and likewise it doesn't really diminish how magic would work with her. That being said, I know many players take exception to the actual tedium of drawing magic, particularly early on, and particularly high-level magic too. And I do get the frustration there, the random aspect of that, because, for example, you can spend 5,000 gil to draw Ultima at the Shumi village, and because it's random, sometimes it will only give you one Ultima, and then you've just been burnt for 5k. But I think the intention here is to purposefully throttle magic acquisition so that you can't simply super buff your characters early in the game. For me personally, in some ways I'd argue that it reaches the same conclusions as other Final Fantasy leveling systems, just by a different means. And what I mean by that is, yes, you spend time toiling in battles, constantly drawing magic from enemies, but this is analogous in some ways to toiling away in battles to defeat enemies, basically grinding to level your characters, as you do in other games anyway. I think the key difference here, Firstly, the number of battles is arguably less because you can just endlessly draw from an enemy in a single battle. And secondly, you have more customization potential for how your characters level based on what summons and junction abilities you give each character. So, where in most Final Fantasy games you are beholden to a character's stats that are set arbitrarily in the back end, and occasionally depending on what armor slots or accessories you give them, Final Fantasy VIII offers substantially more control to the player to build out basically character loadouts based on combinations of GF magic and junction abilities. So it was very much intended to be a liberating and fully customizable system for the players to engage with here. This leads on to a second facet of system design regarding battle and GFs, which is this Pokemon-esque catch them all, nurture them structure of the game. Now, Final Fantasy VIII is often criticised for enemies that scale alongside the characters, and thus this makes for the argument that players should just avoid battles altogether and game the system early. And granted, this is a valid playthrough path for those inclined to do so. But that being said, I'd also suggest that it's a pretty stunted way to play the game too, and learning the really advanced Guardian Force abilities, getting them to work effectively by keeping them equipped to specific characters and building up that relationship system between character and GF, not to mention doing ancillary tasks like acquiring super rare magic or rare items to build your weapons in junk shops. All of this relies on engaging in battles to some degree or other. So while yes, you can game the system to try and not scale enemies, I would also suggest that a lot of the fun of Final Fantasy VIII and a lot of the customization in Final Fantasy VIII is sort of circumvented if you choose to do it that way. And ultimately, Final Fantasy VIII isn't the hardest game in the world anyway. So yeah, I do question the necessity of doing that or the desire to do that, aside from just the novelty factor of it. So that's the fundamentals of the battle, levelling and abilities system in a nutshell, which Final Fantasy VIII brought to the table. And each of these work according to the laws of the setting and indeed the story, which centres quite heavily, as I've said, on this concept of junctioning. So I will just wrap up on some final novelties of system design, which is firstly the seed rank system, which is how we earn money in the game. And where prior and subsequent Final Fantasy titles lean on some combination of earning gil from battles or bartering items, Final Fantasy VIII, once again being beholden to its unique story and nothing else, pays us a periodic salary based on both our conduct as mercenaries and academic performance as students. So we can influence our salary amount by completing tests via the menu and get paid more frequently based on our step count in the world, which thus again rewards exploration and engagement with the game. This likely ties into why weapon upgrades aren't based purely on having enough gil, because gil essentially becomes infinite by the time you're 2/3 into the game. And rather they require us to explore, as I say, engage with the world, engage with some prerequisites, such as finding magazine articles, and then finding increasingly rare items to get the best weapons. So in its own way, this cool little ecosystem of battling and exploration and even like card acquisition and stuff. And yeah, I think each of these systems really complement one another in their own way. So for example, the refinement abilities that we can learn with GFs allow us to refine items, so we need to sort of engage in battles to get the GFs learning those abilities. All of this required engagement with the game and a real attentiveness, I think. And personally, I always quite liked these additions, for the most part at least, and despite being introduced to the series with Final Fantasy VII and having that as my baseline expectation of a Final Fantasy experience as a kid, I think the willingness to experiment and play with game design in Final Fantasy VIII with the ultimate intent of augmenting the setting and story was a net positive. And where things like enemy scaling have generally been considered negative by players, and JRPGs traditionally working the opposite way, where grinding enables easier battles, Final Fantasy VIII changed strategy here to encourage smarter play via junctioning, and for example reducing encounters using Enk None, levelling enemies up or down with those certain commands that we can learn, rather than simply just grinding through the game and smashing our way through battles. So really quite strategic, smart means of play that was intended to empower the player in quite a novel way. Looking now to story, and specifically story structure, Final Fantasy VIII again took an interesting approach right from the get-go in how it launched into events. What we see here is, firstly, a very cinematic approach to the opening FMV, and rather than an opening scenario that we pick up from as the player, we have instead a montage of past, present and future events layered together in a montage like a movie trailer. And I can't really understate or overstate the fact of how innovative this was. We hadn't seen anything like this before from a Final Fantasy game, and arguably in any game at the time. The opening FMV was a clear boasting of the visual fidelity, motion capture and graphical advances that the Squaresoft team had made since Final Fantasy VII's release. And it was a statement, I think, of Final Fantasy as a flagship and AAA brand. And just to segue for a moment on this point, it's notable just how liberally the FMV sequences are used to embellish and frame and progress the story in Final Fantasy VIII, because where Final Fantasy VII gave us maybe one or two notable scenes in the first disc, with the most epic being Cloud on the motorcycle escaping from Shinra Tower, by the time we reach the end of disc 1 in Final Fantasy VIII, we've had the opening montage FMV, the epic battle. We've had the siege of Dole in that Saving Private Ryan style siege. We've had the ballroom dance sequence with Renoa and the attack on Adia, each having played out with some minor FMVs in between. We also have each key party member receiving a little FMV intro vignette that nods to their personality, whether that's Quistis arriving at the infirmary and sort of sighing at the sight of Squall, Zell enthusiastically shadowboxing, and Selphie Ditzley slipping down that hill, and of course Irvine playing it cool on the lawn at Galbadia. So Final Fantasy VIII uniquely employs FMVs to deliver both dramatic story beats and character vignettes. It was really boasting this because they were quite top heavy in the first disc, I think, and is once more a testament to the innovations they were pushing for, but also Kitase in particular, this cinematic inclination that he has for visual storytelling and sort of flashy design. The second thing the opening FMV of Final Fantasy VIII does is uniquely front-load the action and the dramatic moments before the player takes control. So where most Final Fantasy games before and since sort of throw us into the middle of a dramatic mission like a reactor bombing or kidnapping the princess or whatever, Final Fantasy VIII shows an action-packed fight scene followed by a complete shift into a calm, tranquil moment. And the player takes control of our hero Squall in an infirmary bed. Sunlight's beaming in through a window, there's a gentle breeze, birdsong can be heard outside. It is the very antithesis of how most Final Fantasy games introduced a hero and story, yet one that I think plays into and works very well in crafting this cosy, lighter atmosphere of Final Fantasy VIII and the undertone of the story as a coming-of-age tale, which I very much think it is. The fact that we find Squall being nurtured by a doctor, being collected by a teacher, and thereafter attending class assignments attests to Final Fantasy VIII as this story of personal growth and growing up, where Squall begins as someone who is in the care of adults, and from there he builds towards a position of autonomy, leadership and adulthood. And this occurs at pivotal moments in the game, such as Sid Kramer naming Squall as the leader of Garden. But in keeping with this opening stanza, the scenic environment of Balam Garden, the soothing music that accompanies it as students go about their day, it all conjures this strange and instant nostalgia for a mercenary high school experience that one never had. It captures perfectly a sense of carefree teenage innocence before the travails of adulthood, and the seemingly banal tasks of attending registration, showing a new student around the school, and checking assignments on the school computer. They each have a certain familiarity and tangible sense of reality about them, while at the same time juxtaposing wildly with how the story thereafter escalates into this time-bending epic, and indeed our students' status as mercenaries in training. So the school days opening of FF8 blends in an absurdist way with the fantasy aspects of the story. As an academy that is training mercenaries in a fantasy world, we are also fighting acquirable deities like Ifrit. We are having our graduating exam graded based on our conduct in an active war zone, and thereafter we are sent around the world to do various peacekeeping, espionage and combat missions. So this world that we are thrust into might seem strange, but looked at through the prism of Japanese pop culture, shonen media and bits like that, it's not dissimilar from the more fantastical manga or anime arcs that are often with a protagonist that often starts off in high school. And on this note, I've always had an underlying assumption that one's reception to a given Final Fantasy or their favourite Final Fantasy can be informed by at what point in life they discovered the series and a given game. Because personally speaking, I wasn't even a teenager at the time Final Fantasy VIII came out, but I played it consistently as a kid going into my teenage years, and so it vibed with me, and I think I chimed with the characters and these teenage feelings they have a little bit more. In a similar way, I know people that are 10 years older than me who will die on the hill that Final Fantasy VI is the best game ever made and Final Fantasy VIII is crap. So I think age can be a factor, particularly with very time-specific coming-of-age stories like Final Fantasy VIII. Though I have been since humbled in this opinion by the number of comments I get from younger people who love these titles from the 90s, which is great. So returning to the structure of Final Fantasy VIII, it escalates quickly, and like many Final Fantasies, it goes from a specific isolated scenario, in this case passing our seed exam and taking on our first mission, into a macro event over the course of its first disc. And while many Final Fantasies do this, and they do it very well, I think really looking at the moments that transpire early in FF8, we can see how layered and nuanced and joined up this story really is. It's often accused of being convoluted, which is perhaps true, but it's also coherent and cohesive, and it offers several intriguing hooks and hints throughout that keep the player curious as to what's really going on. So probably the best example of this is the party experiencing the first Laguna dream, which is a complete curveball moment out of nowhere that we'll cover in a moment. But additionally, we have this mysterious girl alone appearing in the first minute of the game by Squall's bed. We have Cypher hinting at his romantic dream. And of course, we have the opening FMV itself, which foreshadows so much of the later story, such as the Sorceress, Squall and Renua in the Flower Field, and various moments that we're yet to see. So Final Fantasy VIII is unique in how it's so suggestive of what's yet to come and the grander mysteries yet to be revealed, rather than being so specifically in a moment like other Final Fantasy games. And indeed, just to illustrate the point, even some seemingly random self-contained events are revealed to have much bigger implications later on. So we have the first mission at Dole, for example. This seems first and foremost to be our hero's final exam to graduate. It's an important building block for the story because we're introduced to the main geopolitical adversary, which is the Galbadian military. We get a lot more insight into the personalities of our characters, particularly the begrudging rivalry between Squall and Cypher. We meet Zell, we meet Selphie, so on. So in the Dole mission, the stage is set, key characters are introduced, and we pass our seed exam, and that's great. However, appreciating the layered nature of Final Fantasy VIII storytelling, not only is the Dole mission and the liberation of the communications tower directly correlative to President Deling later in the game giving the first live broadcast in decades at Timber, but it is also correlative to the Laguna story from the past as well, because attentive players will note that the reason live broadcast in the world has been disrupted in the first place is because Laguna liberated Esthar. He sent Sorceress Egill up into space, where her tomb causes radio interference down on the planet. So very nuanced storytelling and world building here. No single scenario is random or irrelevant in Final Fantasy VIII, but it feeds very much into building the setting or a character or some sort of world building aspect within the game. And indeed, a great discovery by players years after Final Fantasy VIII's release, and I don't know how they managed to spot this, because I certainly didn't on my tiny 4x3 14-inch TV, are the hidden messages in the television static at Timber from the trapped Sorceress Egill up in her tomb, and the red writing reads, "I am alive, bring me back," stuff like that, which is both quite creepy but also a fantastic attention to detail and joined up storytelling that Final Fantasy VIII really leans into. Continuing with the overall structure of the story before getting into detail, the game is one of successive escalation and consistently raising stakes. Indeed, for what is ostensibly a mission-based opening and a mission-based mercenary profession, for our seed heroes there is no defined format of completing a mission, return to base, repeat, like other mission-focused games. Metal Gear Solid 5 was a random example. But rather, Final Fantasy VIII's arc takes us on an unwieldy chain of events which our characters are increasingly becoming embroiled in. And indeed, a rather comical observation that I read some time ago notes that, aside from acquiring Ifrit at the beginning of the game, our heroes don't actually succeed in any of the official tasks that are given to them. The Dole mission is a failure because Garden weren't paid enough, so Galbadia just take the communications tower. The timber mission is a failure because we fall into the trap of kidnapping a decoy president, and the sorceress assassination mission ends with our party being imprisoned. And even preventing the missile strikes against Garden, while we do canonically save Baalam Garden, it does come at the cost of Trebia. But this is because the central thrust of Final Fantasy VIII is about so much more than completing missions. Firstly, we do indeed learn that completing missions is simply a means to an end. It's all in service of a grander fated threat, which Squall must ultimately contend with. But secondly, I'd go so far as to suggest that the failure and misadventures during these missions is essential to the coming-of-age aspect of the tale. It's about Squall learning that there's more to life than simply the mission, and even missions themselves don't go to plan. You really need to rely on other people when things hit the fan. And these are the things that our stoic, introverted protagonist Squall must contend with in each escalating dilemma in this gradual ascent that he has towards leadership. This is why I think one of the most pivotal moments in the game is the Battle of the Gardens. It is in this moment that Squall, perhaps without realising it, is taking control. Up to this point, things have simply been happening to the party. They've operated in a very chaotic, reactive way to a stream of events that are just kind of bombarding them. And there's a notable scene where Squall freaks out about Cypher's supposed execution, which I've always felt could be for a few reasons. Firstly, it's the loss of a rival and someone that Squall sees a lot of himself in. It's almost like a part of himself has died. But also too, it's because it's a chaotic, unexpected event, and Squall cannot control it. This is Squall coming into contact with the real world as someone growing up and going through this coming-of-age sort of dilemma. And this is why that Sid Kramer, having forced Squall into a position of responsibility by the time the Battle of the Gardens rolls around, is the turning point for his character. We notably steer Squall in giving decisive orders in this moment, whether that's protecting junior classmen or protecting the hot dogs. And it's from this point on in the game that Squall becomes a much more decisive, assertive character. The internal monologues where he's constantly questioning his purpose and doubting things slowly disappears. He decisively abandons Garden to take Rinoa to Esthar and stuff like that. And so the second half of Final Fantasy VIII, while on the one hand it is increasingly insane with flying schools and space travel and time compression and stuff, it is actually in some respects much clearer cut too, because the fated goal to defeat the future sorceress becomes clear, and it's about Squall kind of becoming assertive and rising to that fated challenge. Now, one can't discuss the narrative structure of Final Fantasy VIII without considering Laguna Loire and the past events that we are periodically witness to. The decision to make Final Fantasy VIII's story operate on a dual timeline was a very bold one, and it's one that I personally love. I think that it's a huge aspect of what distinguishes the game and gave it this depth and profundity that it wouldn't otherwise have. I have learnt that this is not universally felt among Final Fantasy VIII players. I've received comments over the years where I've touched on Laguna or some other aspect of the game, and there are people that feel Laguna either doesn't get enough inclusion, something that the dream sequences just made no sense and didn't move the story forward, and some simply don't like Laguna, which is fair enough. Not all stories are for everyone. But for my part, looping back to the layeredness, the subtlety, and yes, perhaps the convolution of Final Fantasy VIII and the key themes of the game, which we'll touch on, Laguna's inclusion is paramount to all of this. Indeed, the flashback sequences break up this sense of a linear trajectory and the chaotic events that are happening to Squall on his missions. They give more texture and pacing and intrigue to what's going on in this story. And I think visiting the past and noting how it lays the foundations for what's going on in the present really just gives a sense of a lived-in, linked-up history and makes Final Fantasy VIII unique, but also puts the onus on the player too to join up the dots and simply pay attention to what's being said and what's being shown. So a case in point of this that I particularly like, because for the longest time I felt like it was the one dream sequence that really didn't add anything, is the fourth Laguna dream, where we have Laguna starring in a movie as a sorceress's knight. A ruby dragon shows up and we have to defeat it. And it was, a few years, it was several playthroughs until I noticed, or I think I read it in a forum. Firstly, the final 30 seconds of the dream is what links up this dream to the macro story and its relevance to the grander story, which is Laguna witnessing the lunar cry taking place in Esthar in the distance. And that's the final step in his adventure that brings him to that fabled city. But more so than that, it's how Laguna's role as a knight in this movie links up with Cypher, and he has this one-handed gunblade stance which is identical to Cypher's, and it basically shows rather than tells and heavily infers that Cypher's romantic dream to be a knight stems from the movie that Laguna is starring in. And I think it's the Ultimania and maybe the info panel in the game that gives a bit more information about that. It's a Sorceress's Knight called Zephyr. He was the first Sorceress's Knight, and there's a bit of lore around that as well. But I really liked it because it was so subtle and sleight of hand that it takes a while to notice it. And indeed, I think Final Fantasy VIII being this game that keeps on giving every time we play it. I only actually found out on a recent playthrough that you can access that location of the fourth Laguna Dream from the world map as Squall. So it's not marked on the world map, but you can get there and get into that pre-rendered scene. But returning to the Laguna Dreams, they do, as we've touched on, both subtly and overtly, build up our knowledge of how things in the present day came to be. The central thrust of them is Alone and her mysterious power, which is sought after in both past and present, paving the way for Ultimecia's time travel. And then subtly with each dream, some historical context is offered to the present-day characters and events. And even more banal Laguna dreams like the Windhill monster hunting segment. It gives away crucial hints about both Squall and Rinoa's parentage, for example. Now, despite the treasure trove of context that's given in these dreams, it's the way that they are cut into the present-day events that is brilliantly done, I think, because they are sudden pivots that break up the tense action, and they often arrive at pivotal moments and turning points. So for example, in the wake of Squall getting icicled by Idea, we wake up in the Windhill dream. Journeying to Galbadia, we collapse in the forest and wake up in the Central ruins, and so on. The way we are first introduced to the dreams is this momentous curveball for the story, where we are on our way to Timber for our first proper mission, so we're focusing on that, and then we collapse into this first dream and arrive in a scenario that essentially raises more questions than answers when we first experience it. Firstly, we are controlling Galbadian soldiers who are, at this point, the people we understand to be our enemy. But not only that, they are these hapless, comical comrades who, in this sequence, decide to go AWOL and have a night of drinking instead. We witness this guy Laguna fumble his attempts with Julia, the singer, and it plays out like some bizarre fever dream of a vignette where our characters are sort of thinking to themselves, while the dream's taking place, like, what the heck's going on? And as a child, I remember thinking I was somehow playing the game wrong or had made a mistake because it seemed so off-key. But that shift in pace and mood is precisely, I think, what sets the story and the inclusion of these sequences apart from other games in the series. So that being said, the real intrigue in the Laguna sequences, and particularly this first dream, is when we wake up and the party members realise that they've had the same collective dream. The uncanny creepiness of this twist is one of my enduring memories of my first Final Fantasy VIII playthrough, and it was probably the single biggest factor that kept me playing relentlessly this game story, because I really wanted to understand, why is everyone having the same dream? That is such a weird, creepy thing to happen. I wanted to know where, and indeed when, these Laguna sequences were taking place, and such was the great structuring of the dual story, the way it was staggered and paced. It made subsequent parts of the game and subsequent locations that much more interesting, because, for example, we arrive at Delling City as Squall's party shortly after the first Laguna dream, and so this is the first real-world, tangible reference point we have as Squall to what we saw in the Laguna dream. And I'm sure I'm not alone in having gone straight to the hotel in Delling City to see if there was some evidence of Laguna left behind. So, a great additional layer to Final Fantasy VIII, in my opinion, a very distinguishing feature of its story, and a slow-burning arc that eventually reveals and reconciles the past and present stories in Esthar in the final third of the game. And I've seen many commentators sort of talk about Final Fantasy VIII in terms of it being like the Wizard of Oz and this man behind the curtain moment. And yeah, I sort of agree with that. I think that's a really interesting way to look at it and how these stories sort of reconcile towards the end there. Now, a very final note on the Laguna segments before moving on is with regards to the structure and how in recent years Yoshinori Kitase has mentioned the Laguna segments were originally about 50% of the game and they got cut down for release. Now, Laguna fans understandably lament this, and as a big Laguna fan myself, I would also love to see more of Laguna's adventure. I would love a prequel game, to be honest. But on the other hand, I don't wonder if perhaps the writers might have been saved from themselves in some ways too. And what I mean by that is, if in the original cut of Final Fantasy VIII's story, they outright told us or showed us things like Laguna being Squall's father, or how Egill's incarceration destroys live broadcast in the world, or even Cypher explicitly talking about the Laguna movie, I think we might have lost so much of the subtlety and the intrigue around how Final Fantasy VIII's story sort of is delivered. Leaving it to the player to join the dots and discover these things is part of what makes it both convoluted but also awesome, in my opinion. And indeed, even as recently as this year, I was playing through and making an effort to try and talk to all the NPCs at different stages of the story, because obviously they say different things depending on the context. And there's actually a girl at the railway station in Timber who talks about how a guy called Laguna rescued her once from getting hit by a train. You know, on top of that, we have the Timber Maniacs magazines that were put in as a cool side quest, but also as a way to fill in the blanks of how the Laguna story got cut out. And indeed, the Timber Maniacs are doubly interesting because if we read them in a certain sequence before certain Laguna dreams, the Laguna dreams play out differently. So for example, I think if we read the one at the Balam Hotel and then have the first Laguna dream where he goes to Julia's hotel room, he gets drunk and falls asleep before having, you know, the lengthier conversation with her. So interesting stuff going on with the story and how they worked with the cut down version of the original arc. And indeed, a recent comment on the channel mentioned how technical limitations can create innovations, particularly in older games back in the day that had that limited bandwidth. And yeah, I agree with that. And I think that Final Fantasy VIII's ambitious story and how they ultimately told it by stripping down, you know, the game to the few key dream elements was a great example of that. So that's a top-level look at Final Fantasy VIII's narrative structure, which is ultimately a series of very lush, dramatic set pieces that are woven together, whether it's the Dolet mission, the Assassination mission, or the Battle of the Gardens. Each one very visual and cinematic and seemingly chaotic and reactive, but each kind of a building block of this story that leads into this grander arc, tying up with Ultimecia alone, junctioning, and time. So we've covered the broad structure of the story here and this dual narrative approach that Final Fantasy VIII has, and I want to take a step back now and focus on the themes at work within the game before we dive into specific character arcs and how they really embody these themes and work within this narrative structure. So looking to the themes in Final Fantasy VIII, it has long been suggested that the game's prevailing theme is about love. This suggestion has existed ever since the game entered production. Hironobu Sakaguchi somewhat famously suggested it to Yoshinari Kitase, and yes, on the face of it, we can see this adolescent tale of fated love that is present in the game, and it is elevated above all else, including supporting party members. And we could argue that even beyond romantic love, different aspects of love do proliferate through the game in other characters too. So we have Laguna and Julia as a potential love lost. We have Cypher's romantic dream that is perhaps symbolic of a deeper maternal longing. We have Quistis's feelings for Squall, so that's an unrequited love. We have the complex love triangle between Zell, the library girl, and Hot Dogs. And we have Selphie and Irvine, who have these awkward tentative first steps towards revealing feelings for one another. Not to mention, of course, we have Cid and Adia as a married couple and alone trying to reunite Laguna and Rain. So looking at the broadcast of these quite significant characters, each of them has actions and feelings rooted and motivated by a sort of love if we are really looking for it. But ever since I started reflecting on the game critically, and indeed as mentioned when I first reviewed it over a decade ago, I always felt the core theme of Final Fantasy VIII was time, and I suppose time as a measure of one's life, who we choose to be in that time, what we choose to do with it. And this is not necessarily mutually exclusive from the notions of love, and actually I think they work hand in hand in this game to really deliver on the overall story. So jumping in, we can really observe how many aspects of the game are wrapped up into this idea of time. It operates, of course, on a dual timeline between Laguna and Squall, so even on a structural level we have that. We have the cause and effect of past decisions that echo through the narrative and the gameplay into the present, and additionally we have a time-travelling sorceress from the future, Ultimecia, who is the central antagonist and whose very name is synonymous with an ending moment, and she's intent on compressing time into a singularity where only she exists. So on several levels we have time at the core of what's pushing this game forward. Now, I appreciate Ultimecia is a sparsely developed character, and indeed, much as I unabashedly love Final Fantasy VIII, my only real regrets in this game are that Ultimecia, and more so I think alone, aren't really given much explanation or context. That being said, I would suggest that Ultimecia's dialogue segments, particularly in the end of the game, really emphasise and play up this concept of time, and they allude, I think, to some ambiguous trauma that, far from being a sort of arbitrarily evil villain, they seem to hint at some sort of desperation and sadness and regret about finiteness of being that makes Ultimecia perhaps a slightly more sympathetic villain, if we read between the lines. And yeah, there definitely seems to be a degree of regret about her past. There seems to be a fear of dying, which is motivating her, and this desire for time compression. And she's really looking for this perpetual state of being where she will exist forever. Another thing that's interesting is how Rinoa Hartley as a character, quite to the contrary of Ultimecia's outlook on things, is all about grasping life and embracing the time and people that are given to us. A big pitch to Squall at the Fisherman's Horizon concert scene is all about how he needs to trust and rely on people around him, make the most of the time of them being together. And between these two, the importance of time and place is ultimately symbolically delivered in the promise to meet by the flower field. And this is a motif that runs throughout the game, right from the opening moments. As soon as we hit new game, we see that opening FMV. If you come here, you'll find me, I promise. The flower field montage and all of that sort of thing. So everything sort of loops round, and we have time and glimpses of past, present, future as this unifying context, poignantly at the beginning and the end of the game, but running all throughout as well. So it really feels like embracing life is at the core of what Final Fantasy VIII is about. Now, as I've mentioned in the past, where other titles like Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X feature some semblance of afterlife or a continued presence of a loved one in the world after they've gone. So we have the life stream in Final Fantasy VII, we have the far plane in Final Fantasy X, even Final Fantasy XV, it shows us this cathartic presence of our characters in the ending. Final Fantasy VIII has no sense of spiritual, religious, or really overly magical overtones about its world. Life is presented with a sort of existential brutality as fleeting, precious, and going in one direction. And this is evidenced by how desperately Alone wants to go back and change the past in her futile endeavour to show us Laguna and those Laguna dreams. It is something that Squall is taught and encouraged to embrace, and ultimately it's why, despite rumours to the contrary around Squall being dead and Rinoa and Ultimecia and these certain fan theories, I choose to see Final Fantasy VIII as a lecture and a positive message in celebrating life and the time that's offered to us. It's about trying to be open and positive and engaged with those around us, not clinging to the past or trying to change things or live a life of regret, as we see Ultimecia doing. And indeed we see Alone doing that as well, and of course Squall in his orphanage flashbacks. All of these characters are sort of rooted in a stagnance, which Squall as the hero ultimately evolves out of. So time was a huge theme for me. I think it is at the centre of Final Fantasy VIII. And ultimately, I just think it's really strong, if convoluted, in how time compression, all of these time jumps are sort of used in the game. I think it does really well to stick to its own rules about how time works as a single sort of causality, because in a lot of fiction where we get into multiverses and stuff, it becomes quite unwieldy in a lot of media. Final Fantasy VIII, it works in a single chronology, a single continuum, and it has a clear sense of cause and effect that I really, really like, particularly as it's delivered between the Laguna and the Squall stories. Now, I'm going to take a look at the characters, because having talked about the basic narrative structure of the game, I think rather than plotting through each subsequent thing that happens as it happens, looking at the characters is perhaps the best way, or the most interesting way to see how the story plays out, how they contribute. Now, Final Fantasy is of course a series that's renowned in part because it has these wonderful fellowship quests that feature a variety of characters with their own backgrounds, dilemmas and objectives going on. Final Fantasy VIII does have less of that in terms of the central party, but it does nonetheless, I think, have a rich tapestry of characters, both good and bad, major and minor, that make it a very memorable instalment. So, turning to Final Fantasy VIII's characters, we have an excellent cast here that features quite a broad set of enjoyable recurring party members and NPCs, and indeed another trait of Yoshinori Kitase is these recurring and thus subtly evolving characters that feature, throughout a game's story. He tends to introduce NPCs that have their own sort of subtle arc going on, and Final Fantasy VIII is much the same as this. It has a similar host of recurring encounters with the likes of the comical Biggs and Wedge to the morally conflicted Raijin and Fujin that feature throughout the game's story. And I just want to take a moment to focus on these peripheral characters a little bit, because I think it's underappreciated just how much they add to the overall and the emotive experience of Final Fantasy games that we don't necessarily see much in other game series or other genres or titles. And what I mean here is how characters like Biggs and Wedge or Raijin and Fujin offer a certain texture and human element to the story. It's not so simple or clear-cut as to divide the game into good guys and bad guys, and we could say the Turks in FF7 are like this as well. But there is a range of agendas and perspectives at work in the game. Taking Biggs and Wedge first, much like Laguna, Kiros and Ward, they give us another perspective of the Galbadian military, and rather than being arbitrary villains, we see these two somewhat hapless soldiers trying to make ends meet. They are following what is probably a logical and surefire career path in the war economy of Galbadia by ascending the ranks of the Galbadian war machine. And other examples of this necessity, I suppose, of living in Galbadia, rather than necessarily being ideologically driven, can be seen in other Galbadian soldiers we encounter, such as the guard on the train during the Timber mission, who keeps interrupting the decoy President Deling, lamenting that he's going to lose paychecks if he keeps pestering him. But Biggs and Wedge are probably the best example of this. They are at the humorous end of the spectrum too, with this bumbling Scooby-Doo villain or Wile E. Coyote villainy going on. They are haplessly trying to defeat us constantly and keep getting demoted with every attempt. And it's I suppose a tragicomic glimpse at the human condition, a light-hearted reprieve from the severity of the story, and also in its own microcosm of existence, ultimately a story arc unto itself, and actually quite a redeeming one, since our final interaction with Biggs and Wedge isn't a grand showdown or a battle to the death, but rather we see Biggs, tired of his lot in life, basically quit the military, and he takes Wedge with him. This sort of grey character or anti-villain type is echoed similarly in Raijin and Fujin. Again, they are not major or deeply explored characters, but it is interesting in how, by circumstance rather than ideology or intent, they find themselves at odds with the heroes of the story at several intervals. And their commitment to cipher has always been quite an intrigue for fans of Final Fantasy VIII, and the culminative moment where, like Biggs and Wedge before them, they basically give up on this insane imperialist campaign for the sorceress, and specifically Cypher's unhinged serving of it. And in quite a poignant moment, they turn around and abandon him. So, despite their fleeting inclusion, I think Raijin and Fujin do add something to Final Fantasy VIII. They have an interesting design, they have idiosyncratic dialogue, and this faithfulness to Cypher that do give them a certain edge and relevance. And even if we don't know much about them personally, and I think the only thing we really learn about them is that Raijin likes fishing, but they do drive the story, and I think them giving up on Cypher really serves to elevate and emphasise just how far gone he is, even if his closest confidants have sort of given up on him. So they really contribute to that Cypher arc. So that's a quick glimpse at some of the recurring characters we have in the game. and the subtle kind of character arcs that are at work throughout Final Fantasy VIII on numerous levels. And there's a bunch of characters through this game that have their own little scenarios, their own little perspective on things that really builds out the worlds and events of the game. Whether that's General Caraway or Martine, Mayor Dobe, who has an entire segment that was a very interesting critique, I think, on the limits of pacifism, and I've made a video discussing that in the past. And finally, actually, Zone and Watts too, who are again another example of this odd couple dynamic. Moving on to the central cast of Final Fantasy VIII, I'd like to focus now on the key party members who orbit Squall and Rinoa, Adia's orphans who are each connected by shared history and an amnesic childhood. Now, the party of Final Fantasy VIII does come under criticism from some players in how, on the surface at least, they lack the variety of party members found in other games. Far from being a motley collective of characters that we adopt along the way on some epic adventure, Final Fantasy VIII's party members come almost exclusively from the same place. They are acquired very early in the game, and they are, for the most part, blank slates in terms of skill set or character class, where we can customise them however we like. And it's only really their limit breaks that distinguish them or nod towards some vestiges of a job class system. That being said, I personally like Final Fantasy VIII's approach to the party members and the Fellowship quest. I feel that the variety is meant to come from the fact that we control both the present-day Squall party and the Laguna party of the past. They are very different personalities and very different characters, so that's where the sort of variability is intended to come from, I think. I think the Final Fantasy VIII party do have their own identities, their own histories and challenges to overcome that I think play into this aforementioned theme of time, the aforementioned theme of discovering oneself. So I do have character episodes discussing most major characters in FF8, but I will link those in the description. In fact, I'll link to the whole plethora of FF8 videos I have if you're interested. But I will give a top-level look at them here, because I think they're really important to how this story plays out. Now, the narrative intrigue around the main party stems largely from the fact that they are all orphans, and largely from the fact that they are amnesic to boot. In many respects, they are sort of blank slate personalities that have had to build up ideas of themselves, construct identities from themselves. As mentioned, they are not entirely dissimilar to Squall in this respect, in how they present themselves in a certain way that is diametrically opposed to their aforementioned insecurities. So, how we find them at the beginning of the game, they are living inauthentically until at some point in the game they have to reconcile and become a truer version of themselves. Sounds a bit abstract and wayward as a concept, but for example, the first party member that we are introduced to is Quistis. Now, for the opening part of the game, Quistis is presented as a mature and competent instructor and leadership figure, and yet it is increasingly revealed, as time wears on, that she harbours these real insecurities and a lack of confidence in herself that sees her fumble around Squall. She subsequently loses her instructor license, and she periodically gives in to her emotions, such as abandoning her post during the assassination mission to go and apologise to Rinoa. She also gets upset during the Lighthouse retrospective, kind of conjuring her feelings of Squall, so on and so forth. And although, as I say, you know, the main party is sort of fleetingly really explored in terms of their personal histories, but we do know from conversations with Quistis that some of her insecurities stem from never being able to settle into an adoptive home. This is something that plagues the secondary party members, with the exception perhaps of Zell. But I think a lot of Quistis' insecurities stem from this longing and this want of love. This is something that is echoed in other characters, like Selphie, for example, who, despite being an upbeat and quite affable character, seems very isolated at times as well. You know, when she goes off on her own on the timber train, and when she is confronted with the advances from Irvine, which frankly would freak out anyone, the way Selphie reacts to that, I think it speaks to someone who perhaps doesn't know or understand how to react, you know, what it's like to be wanted when they have spent their lives in transience between homes, between gardens, so on. Even Irvine, who comes across largely as a lascivious fool in this game, he does have a sentimental side that is seen quite sparingly and mostly in childhood, but so too does he have his moments of reprieve. He has this monologue on the basketball court that brings everyone back together and rekindles their childhood memories. He has this inability to go through with the assassination mission. Whether that's because he remembers Matron or not is up for debate. But I think there probably is a genuine desire for affection too, that manifests in Irvine in this absurd facade as a smooth ladies' man. Turning to Zell, I always felt Zell was standing a little apart from this in the central party. So in terms of his inauthentic self, he's introduced as a bit of a loud upstart. He's very quick to anger. He's very quick to respond to things. He has this rebellious behaviour with the T-board. He has this Mike Tyson tattoo on his face, which all speaks to a sort of rough around the edges sort of personality. Indeed, looking back at the game to the context of the time, even his outfit with these baggy 3/4 length jeans and stuff, it has this sort of alternative outsider skater look of the late 90s. But really, beyond this facade, Zell is actually quite a sensitive, considerate and good-natured guy. He doesn't like breaking the rules, which we see in childhood and in the present day, and it is Cypher that constantly reminds us that Zell is a chicken wuss, as he puts it. So yeah, in the flashback with the fireworks, in the Dole mission when Cypher wants to break ranks, it is Zell who is shown to be someone that is quite well behaved. So I always liked Zell as this contradiction in terms as a character. He's clearly very smart and studious, which is why he's given periodic information drops to us at the Deep Sea Research Centre and on the train to Timber. And he's very well adjusted, all things considered, which may well stem from the fact that he was the only orphan who was successfully adopted into Barlam town. So that's a really top level look at the main party and how they mirror these themes that is present in Squall's personality in their own particular ways. As I say, I don't think they are very deeply explored. I would also say that they are far from two-dimensional, as they are often accused. They each have personal histories, unique identities. It's just fair to suggest that each of them, although we do control them in specific scenarios like Quistis in the city sewers or Zell in the Battle of the Gardens, for example, they don't really have dedicated quest lines that explore their arcs so much. And so everything meaningful about them, like much of Final Fantasy VIII, is confined to subtlety and passing references and player attentiveness. And for example, I'm not sure if I read this somewhere or if I've developed my own mad headcanon, but Irvine's curveball inclusion to the assassination mission, the fact that he isn't captured afterwards by the Galbadians, and the fact that he goes to the prison specifically to rescue Rinoa, it has me obsessed with the idea that he is planted in the party as a stooge for Caraway, although there's nothing to suggest that in the game. It's just inference if you look at the events a certain way. Moving on to more prominent characters, we have Rinoa Hartley, who is the female lead and the central love interest of Final Fantasy VIII's story. Now, relating back to these base themes about living life well, about time and the time we're given, and of course the theme of love, I think Rinoa embodies these in their most positive sense. A large part of her role in the story is encouraging Squall to relinquish his fears, open up to others, and live his best life. In tandem to this, we have the fated love story and romantic arc between the two characters. And so Final Fantasy VIII is underpinned by key scenes that feature Rinoa, from the flower field and the ballroom sequence to Rinoa's monologue at Fisherman's Horizon and aboard the Ragnarok when Squall rescues her. And that being said, I think Rinoa is far from simply being a two-dimensional love interest who helps Squall. She does have her own arc, she does have her own issues to contend with. Indeed, relating back to this odd coupling that I mentioned with minor characters in the game, I would suggest that Squall and Rinoa also begin as just such an odd couple, where Squall is this quiet, reserved, standoffish guy, and Rinoa has this ambitious, optimistic brashness about her. And indeed, it's interesting that we see little nuances of this in both the characters. For example, we see their bedrooms, and bedrooms, you know, they're quite intimate spaces, they're quite subtle in Final Fantasy VIII, we don't see them a lot, but they also say a lot about an individual. And so where Squall has this austere dorm room with no decoration, Rinoa has this bright pink room with rather more ostentatious furnishings in it. So with her, it represents a certain confidence and outwardness, and reflects the extroverted ambitions that she has at the beginning of the game. And actually, when I first played the game as a kid, Rinoa was a huge favourite of mine, owing to her personality, because, like a lot of Final Fantasy VIII fans, I did see something of myself in Squall, quite quiet and introverted, perhaps too quiet, and the prospect of a Rinoa character tapping into that and helping one overcome that, rather than chastise it, was very appealing. But that being said, it's interesting how perceptions of stories and characters can change through the passage of time and one's own maturity, because as I got older and kept returning to Final Fantasy VIII, it was interesting to see how Rinoa could be seen as flawed in her own way. You know, she's quite naive early on, I think, and that became much clearer to me. I could suddenly understand Squall's frustrations with her, the timber owls during that timber mission just plopping down on the floor and hatching this ill-conceived plan. I could understand Quistis's frustration with Rinoa in wanting to trick the sorceress with an Odin bangle. And I think it shows perhaps how both Squall and Rinoa's personalities do have their pros and cons. And while the game is often viewed as Rinoa saving Squall, I think too that she arrives at a certain maturity and acknowledgement of reality and personal limitations too. So the scene on the basketball court is significant here, because while it does reveal, you know, the orphan past and all of that stuff, it is where Rinoa confesses how she feels like she falls behind when she's confronted with the realities of battle. And more so once she becomes a sorceress, we have this scene aboard Ragnarok, where for the first time we really see Rinoa express fears about the future and how she's going to be received as a sorceress. It is, I think, the closest thematic overlap that she has with Ultimecia's personality and perspective on things, where the latter, as we've touched on, is rooted in fear and despair rather than Rinoa's hope and optimism. And indeed, just as Squall and Cypher have a certain duality that we will come on to, I think Rinoa and Ultimecia have a very similar symbolism and duality in their status as sorceresses, but also their polarised, I suppose, glass half full, glass half empty perspectives on the world and time too, which is really interesting, and it's one of the few things that I would have loved to have seen explored or amplified just a little bit more. Because firstly, it loops Ultimecia thematically in with Rinoa and the existential outlook on life a little bit more. It prevents this void for fan theories to take hold that I think undermine the central message of the game. But also on top of that, I think it would have elevated Rinoa in the end game too, making the fight against Ultimecia as much her battle of ideology as it is Squall's. But as it stands, Rinoa remains distinct in how this conviction and hope drives her character, and indeed ultimately salvages Squall from time compression in the end game, which is where the foreshadowed promise in the flower field comes from in the opening seconds of the game. This ultimately pays off. So a great macro arc for Rinoa, I think. Great chemistry with Squall, and a payoff for the fated love story angle. So a couple of final points on Rinoa is how, despite being a vocal outsider of the group, not having been a seed or a trained fighter, Rinoa also has an inferred childhood trauma when looking between the lines of this story. We know that her mother, Julia, was killed in a car crash. We know that her relationship with her father, General Caraway, is subsequently strained, whether that's the death of her mother or his political allegiances or both that's caused that. And it's notable that she goes by her mother's maiden name instead of the surname Caraway, for example. So while she does orbit outside of the orphan group and that shared heritage, there is a lot of inferred dilemma in Rinoa's past that is comparable to them, and her reactionary nature and decision to join Timber Owls is notable in how it's a middle finger to the father. And actually, despite featuring in just one scenario in the game, I felt that Fury Caraway, like many of the scenario-specific characters, was really intriguing in how he subtly infers certain perspectives on the world and on the characters, like Rinoa. So for example, in plotting the assassination, Caraway's actions are basically treasonous against his country. And yet, I think we could also largely suggest that he is being patriotic for doing that. So what this scenario does is it shows an inner glimpse at the power struggles and the varying perspectives within Galbadia that paint it as a far more nebulous and complex situation and state than some sort of arbitrary evil empire. Likewise, Caraway's decision to lock Rinoa in the house during the assassination mission, while on the one hand it does seem like a bit of a dick move and it does give us a truly tedious dungeon segment. I also think that in deed rather than words, it shows his love, albeit a tough love, towards his daughter. So, interesting moment with Caraway there. Like Mayor Dobe later on, we see these various ideological and political positions emerge that are much more suggestive of a conflicted and multifaceted world. And aside from running around outside the presidential palace yelling about his assassination plan, Caraway is a pretty savvy and an interesting part of the story. I also personally like how Squall kind of likes Caraway. He likes his no-nonsense demeanour, and I do think there are similarities between these two characters, which is probably one for the psychoanalysts. Yeah, I've gone completely off track on Rinoa here. So just to wrap up on her, I think making her a sorceress is another really interesting curveball in Final Fantasy VIII. And much like the Galbadian military, right when we think we've developed a concept of who's good and who's bad in this story, Final Fantasy VIII pivots and shows us that this world is a lot more nuanced. So Rinoa as sorceress, it's probably not as appreciated to the extent that it should be, because it's often viewed through the prism of how it affects Squall and the love story, galvanising him into action and committing to his feelings. But it's notable on several levels, and I've covered bits like this in the past. For example, Final Fantasy's common trope of having a magical female lead in the party, so the sorceress arc really elevates Rinoa up alongside the likes of Terra Branford or Yuna in the broader canon of female leads. In all, Rinoa, great contribution to the story. I would have loved to have seen closer ties or dialogue links with the sorceress angle, with Adia or Adel or Ultimisia, but ultimately the story isn't really diminished too much without it. Now, before turning to Squall, I want to take a quick look at Cypher Almasy, and if you are at all familiar with this channel, you will know that there is something of a Justice for Cypher fan club here. I've got at least 3 videos dedicated to discussing him, and many more that reference his arc and his inclusion. And I appreciate that there are players out there, a fair few, that don't particularly warm to Cypher. He is temperamental, he's antagonistic, he betrays Garden, and there are those that view him as an almost fascist sort of character in both design, deed and action. But personally, I always found him to be one of the most interesting characters in Final Fantasy VIII. He's a guy that, largely because of these flaws and these follies, strikes me as quite human. And like these flawed protagonists of Greek tragedies, even flawed protagonists we see in more recent and modernist fiction and fantasy, like Boromir is a great example that I've used in the past. Cypher's one of these characters that's led down the road to ruin by his own hubris, if nothing else. Cypher is also steeped in symbolism, inferred narrative relevance, and a certain fatedness alongside the main protagonist, Squall. Indeed, right from the outset of the game with the opening FMV, we have this epic Duel of the Fates style sparring going on between Squall and Cypher. It's an action-packed opening cutscene that thoroughly posits Cypher as a formidable foil to the central hero. At the same time, however, there is a duality and a certain similarity between Squall and Cypher too, and despite one being controlled and quiet and the other being antagonistic and brash, they are both, for example, specialists in using the gunblade. They both have a shared history at Adia's orphanage, and there's subconscious similarities too. Whether they'd like to admit it or not, they are quite similar personalities. So they are both quite dismissive of Zell and his energetic personality at the beginning of the game, where Squall dismisses him as just loud, as he puts it, and Cypher constantly calls him chickenless. Additionally, they are both attracted to Rinoa at various points of the game. So Rinoa, when we first meet her, she hints at this prior blossoming relationship or something going on with Cypher. And also, when we fight Cypher for the second time, if Rinoa's in the party, he will reference that sort of blossoming romance there too. So Rinoa being someone that both Squall and Cypher desire at various stages is quite interesting and perhaps telling of how they are similar. And I've actually seen some readings of the game from certain fans that defend Cypher a little bit, that Cypher is something of a discarded hero, and they try and posit Squall as something of a douchebag that steps in and steals the girlfriend and steals the attention of Headmaster Sid and stuff, which was quite an amusing read. And finally, perhaps most importantly, we have what prompts the respective character arcs of both Squall and Cypher, which is that they both crave attention and miss to some degree, a maternal figure. So with Squall, we have Big Sis, or Alone, on the one hand, and with Cypher, we have the character of Matron in the guise of a sorceress on the other. And this is, in many ways, I think, the root of both of their insecurities and the ambitions that they strive towards in later life. It is what propels their stories and their personalities forward over the course of the game. So I really like how Squall and Cypher are two sides of the same coin, and how, while they are outwardly kind of contesting one another, there is a lot of begrudging respect between them too. And we see these brief moments of familiarity and acknowledgement when Cypher coaxes Squall to abandon their post on the Dole mission to prove themselves, for example. We also see it when Squall freaks out about the news that Cypher has been executed. And I always felt this was a reflection on how they are similar and almost symbiotic in their coexistence. Hearing that Cypher had died, it was something like a small death for Squall too. And perhaps most poignantly, we have small moments like Cypher leading the applause when Squall graduates his seed exam. And I love that little moment because it's one of the more overt but fleeting bits of respect and acknowledgement that we see from Cypher. So it shows he's not this arbitrarily two-dimensional villain. He does acknowledge and respect Squall. So, as I say, I've discussed Cypher a bunch of times in the past, and I'll link to those videos, but suffice to say, his delivery in the game, while it is very interesting, I have to concede that it was slightly undermined and unfulfilled in a few ways, owing to the cuts that were made to the game. Firstly, his story seems to peter out to not nothing, but it certainly diminishes in significance as the game wears on. It's clear that he was originally designed as a major inclusion to the story, almost this triangular figure between Squall and Rinoa, if we look at the early marketing material. And this can very much be seen through the first 2 discs of the game, where battles with Cypher bookend each chapter. But as I say, once Ultimecia is revealed, Cypher's relevance sort of ebbs away a little bit. And while I love the suggestion of redemption in his ending FMV, and it was really cool seeing him reconciled with Regina and Fujin, there is certainly an absence of context or reasoning as to how he got there. And, I've referenced in the past, if you look at the original world map design, the orphanage, Adia's orphanage, is listed as Squall and Cypher's memories, and that's quite telling to me because it shows that actually perhaps, we had all the amnesic orphan storyline that I'll come to, but I think originally that it was meant to focus much more on something between Squall and Cypher and this history between the two, rather than what it ended up being, which was the whole party sort of coming from the same place. An additional criticism that's often levelled at Cypher is his gameplay and this sort of ludonarrative dissonance in this assumed formidability that he has. He's a gunblade specialist, he is equal to Squall in a lot of ways, and he kills Odin in what is a pretty cool scene prior to one of our boss fights with him. So we have this real formidable perception of him that is completely undermined by how easy he is to defeat in the boss fights that we have with him. So there's a certain dissonance there in how they are trying to tell this story, because I think on the one hand, Cypher is supposed to be equal to Squall in a lot of ways, but on the other, his dreams are all a facade and he has this mental weakness about him, which is, I think, also supposed to be reflected in his gameplay and his increasingly beaten up appearance and desperation as the game wears on. So it was a bit of a mixed bag there that's often referenced as a negative for Cypher. But this does lead on to how Cypher reflects key themes of the game, I think, and it's the central thrust of his story arc, because all of the aforementioned characters, including Rinoa, grow and mature and shake off their childhood traumas and insecurities and naiveties. They become their authentic selves. Cypher, on the other hand, pursues this fantasy. He is trapped in this dream of becoming a sorceress's knight, and against all better judgment, until it's far too late, he is pursuing this, and it's a very sad decline to see this increasingly desperate persona. So, as I say, I do feel for Cypher on some level. I know a lot of people will dislike him. I think he's quite a tragic and flawed personality, if we acknowledge that he is suffering the same insecurities and traumas as everyone else. Finally, like other characters in the game, Cypher leaves plenty to suggestion and interpretation. There are 2 key things that always stand out to me, which is, firstly, the question of whether or not Cypher remembers the past, where the other orphans don't, because of course in both past and present he has this rivalry with Squall. In both past and present he calls Zell a chicken wuss, and so on. So one does wonder, if Cypher instantly recognises Egill as matron for who she is, and thus wantonly joins her to fulfil this maternal longing. And I think it's fair to suggest that much of his frustration with the party could stem from the fact that nobody else seems to remember or reference the past in this peer group, and perhaps that further galvanises his antagonism towards them. Secondly, despite his rebellious attitude, Cypher is consistently put in positions of leadership and responsibility at Garden, whether that's as Squad B captain or leading the disciplinary committee. And I've seen a few suggestions as to why this might be. In my discussion about Sid Kramer, we explored these theories about whether Sid could be Cypher's father, for example, owing to his obvious leniency, and also little kind of Ludo bits, like he holds Cypher's character card, for example. Personally, I always felt that Sid saw similar potential in Cypher as he does to Squall. I think he acknowledges these similarities between the two, and he tries elevating both of them to positions of leadership and self-realisation in slightly different ways. And it's not impossible to suggest that Cypher really is capable of being a hero, just as Squall is in becoming a villain, because, of course, Squall does say that he would become Renoa's knight if anyone tried taking her away from him. So I think that makes him uncomfortably close to the flaws exhibited by Cypher. And on this note, kind of looking at the variability between Squall and Cypher, the pros and cons, I would also argue that Cypher exhibits free will, where Squall doesn't early in the game. And I've discussed in the past how the Master Norg segment, this illicit benefactor of Garden, looking for stooges who will basically do Garden's bidding without questions asked. I think this is something that Squall is quite susceptible to early on, because, Squall states numerous times he's not one to question his orders, it's none of his business. Cypher, on the other hand, while he is undoubtedly fiery, he's undoubtedly flawed, he does have a degree of self-determinism that Squall lacks, and I think he would be the adverse of what Master Norg is looking for in a stooge. So they both have pros and cons there, they both have virtues and flaws. Moving on to Squall Leonhard as the hero of Final Fantasy VIII, he was a considerable step change from protagonists that we'd seen previously in the Final Fantasy game. Even Cloud Strife, who he draws comparisons with, and he did certainly so at the time, both of them having this past trauma and quite a muted personality. Despite that, and people thinking there's similarities there, he was considerably different. Cloud was written with this brilliant, delicate balance of both sincerity and comic absurdity, and Cloud Strife would often give way to humour, whether that's dressing up as a girl to infiltrate Don Corneo's mansion, riding a dolphin, or threatening to kidnap a dog. Squall Leonhard lacks any of that obvious slapstick humour, and instead he really owns this introverted outlook. He takes himself and his issues very seriously, and while he does have moments of humour, it's uniquely dry and it's quite cutting. So, for example, when he says he dreamt he was a moron, when he tells Quistis to go and talk to a wall and stuff like that. And it's these cutting remarks that, while they are quite funny, they elevate his central trait and flaw, which is a standoffish inability to open up to other people. And his defense mechanism is to push others away, which, as covered when I touched on the other Orphan characters, it hides this past trauma, which is explicitly shown to be his abandonment issues with a lone big sis. So this creates an interesting dynamic with Squall that, like many things, makes Final Fantasy VIII a really unique game. Being unable to open up or willingly engage with other people prevents the usual JRPG fellowship dialogues from taking place, where you rest at an inn, you plan your next moves and take stock and so on. So the character of Squall instead relies largely on inner monologues and thoughts to convey to the player what he's thinking. And personally, I really like these little reprieves that we often have in FF8, where after a dramatic sequence we wake up as Squall in his dorm room, and he has these moments of personal reflection that are communicated to the player, and periodically he's interrupted by his friends who try and take him training or coax him out of his room. Now, owing to this standoffish demeanour, Squall Leonhard doesn't appeal to everyone, and indeed, in the time that I've been on YouTube, I've received a whole bunch of comments from people who put the game down and abandoned Final Fantasy VIII after Disc 1, maybe a bit of the way into Disc 2, because they just couldn't warm up to Squall's personality. And I do get that, Squall is a difficult character early on. I think it's important they presented him as so extreme in his isolation, because it then shows how much transformation he undergoes over the course of the game, where by the ending he's opened up to Rinoa and his friends. And it is a very slow burning arc too. It takes until disc 3 to really get here. So I always feel when I receive these comments, if these guys just stuck it out a little bit more, if they got into disc 3, maybe they'd change their opinion on the game. So I've touched already on the dynamic between Squall and Rinoa. I think they were brilliantly written in how they are so at odds with one another to begin with, but thanks to the opening FMV, which shows a glimpse of the future, the player knows, before Squall and Rinoa do, that they are destined to be together. So part of the fun of this story arc is discovering how that conclusion is reached, rather than whether it's going to be reached. There's also a brilliance, I think, and a bittersweetness to how the pair reflect and branch back to the Laguna story, and where Squall's father Laguna and Rinoa's mother Julia had this brief moment, a meet-cute to connection that felt fated and then passed them by. It's really interesting that it's their respective children who are in fact the fated pair, which I think the shooting star is very emblematic of that. And just thinking about the Star Wars references that always seem to crop up in Final Fantasy games to a greater or lesser degree, there's a bit of a Anakin Skywalker vibe there, because of course Anakin Skywalker was assumed to be the chosen one and to bring balance to the Force, when ultimately it wasn't him, it was the next generation, it was Luke Skywalker. So interesting sort of perhaps similar link with these generational timelines in FF8, I think. Beyond Squall's core story arc with Rinoa, beyond these inferred links with Laguna, there's also several parts of the game that are structurally placed to develop his character over everything else, some of which I've already touched on when we were looking at the narrative structure of the game. Looking at things from a Squall perspective, we firstly have his similarities to Cypher, which are just as important as his differences to Cypher, I think. So we have the Dole scene where Cypher provokes him to break ranks, we have Cypher's presumed death, and Squall vowing to become Rinoa's knight, which I've touched on. All of this works in service of showing the symbolic duality between these two, which, as I say, was sadly diluted by the end in the final cut of the game. But beyond this, we have larger sections of the game that really move the dial on Squall, such as the Barlam Garden insurrection led by Master Norg. And I'm going to segue into this a little bit, because a lot of players really dislike the Norg segment. They felt that this guy's inclusion was pointless, and he was some bizarre curveball and some complete fever dream by the writers. And yeah, to some degree, I do agree. It was a bit of a curveball, it was unexpected, and it's a prime example of the absurdities that one needs to roll with Final Fantasy VIII. I think being an illicit benefactor is fine, and it's actually that's the pretty intriguing part that it's good to focus on. Being a monster that lives in the basement is the weird bit. And it was met with mixed reception. Although personally I liked it. I think it faintly echoes these tropes that we have in other media, like horror films or whatever, where, it's a house with secrets sort of thing. I mean, there's so many layers to that school, as we play through the game. I also think that along with a lot of this Norg segment, it reflects on the dual nature of Garden, the purpose of Garden. Is Garden this morally dubious academy of mercenaries for hire, or is it an edifying opportunity for children from broken homes and that sort of thing? So that's very much the duality between Cid and Norg. And like so many aspects of this game, it casts things in a completely different light. And to be honest, the only thing I didn't like about the Norg scenario, in English at least, was the delivery of the line about Cid and Adir being married. It was really crowbarred in, it was horribly written, like grammatically speaking. So it made this intended big twist of Cid and Adir being married really fall flat, because of how flat that line was written. So anyway, the Norg tangent aside, how does this scene work in service of Squall's character? Well, essentially, this is another step in this coming-of-age tale and maturity. And I think the main thing that the Norg scenario and the Barlam insurrection is intended to do is undermine Cid Kramer as a mentor and a leadership figure. I mentioned earlier how Squall begins the game being looked after by teachers and doctors and that sort of thing. And Cid Kramer is introduced here, delivering this strong speech about conduct on the battlefield, and we feel quite beholden to him, when we go away on this Seed graduation mission. The Norg scenario completely turns that on its head. It diminishes a lot of our impression of Cid. And it's no accident that we see the garden faculty kind of shoving Cid around in this segment. Shortly after that, we hear him telling us that he's been crying and so on. He's revealed to have been perhaps a little bit foolish, a little bit naive, having fallen in with the likes of Norg in the first place. And so what this does is it makes way for Squall to ascend to the leadership of Garden. And it's very shortly after this that Cid hands over the reins to him. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Norg segment is intended to do. And this actually very quickly leads into the Fisherman's Horizon segment, which, again, like the Norg scenario, in and of itself, it isn't a location where any important characters or factions reside. It doesn't move the macro story of Ultimecia forward, but it is a location where Squall, who is now ascending into adulthood, has his first trial where he must engage in leadership and diplomacy with Mayor Dobe, who is a guy that clearly doesn't want him to be there. He's the adverse of what Squall and the institution of Garden sort of stands for. And so it creates a really interesting little musing on pacifism once Galbadia shows up, intent on killing everyone. And I've touched on this in the past, but I really like this little ideological dichotomy between Mayor Dobe, the pacifist, and the realities of the world around him. Indeed, kind of just keeping with Squall, looking at how he matures into this pragmatic leadership demeanour. We have this little dialogue with Mayor Dobe after we defeat Galbadia about idealism, and it would be lovely if everyone was pacifist, but they're just not. So yeah, great segment that I think was meant to encapsulate Squall as a newly minted leader there. So while some of these scenes may feel a bit misplaced for some players, they are pivotal regarding the growth of Squall above all else, or at least positioning him in a place that allows that growth to happen. Coming on to Squall's character arc in conjunction with the Laguna arc, and where he eventually comes to fruition. Firstly, I think the Laguna arc is meant to offer balance and counteract the Squall story in many ways. Laguna as a personality is extroverted and outward and affable compared to Squall's introversion, and so he's intended to thematically oppose Squall, but also serve as a periodic break from Squall's personality as well. And I've discussed in the past that even as a Squall fan, which I am, playing through the first 3 discs of this game with only Squall and this cutting personality that he has, I think that may have been a bit too much. And so I think Laguna really helps with that and structure and pace the game appropriately. That being said, while the Laguna story does build alongside and consistently intrigue us, and it builds to this much sought after reconciliation with the Squall story, when Squall does finally meet Laguna, it's interesting how it's not a big bang moment, it's not a big reveal, because firstly we've learned what's happening with the dreams through Alone anyway, so there's no real reveal left to happen. So by the time Laguna joins the fold, it's much more of a how do you do, let's beat the sorceress together and that sort of thing. And famously, even the I am your father moment doesn't happen. It's left to this quietly inferred dialogue from Kiros and Ward, and we'll speak later, as Laguna says, rather than some sort of grand reveal for Squall. So really quite interesting how these stories reconcile and the two work in tandem there. So just to wrap up on Squall, I always need to mention his design, because as the central hero of the game, he needs to carry some of the thematic and aesthetic weight of the title, and the symbolism around lions, Lionheart and all of that sort of thing. I think it's really good at crafting the idea of his character. It's the bravery of the lion combined with this lone wolf sort of vibe, and everything from the visual imagery of Griever to the wolf-like pelt that he wears on his jacket creates this idea of Squall. His black attire contrasts very much with the white jacket of Cypher, and it reinforces that yin-yang duality between the two that I mentioned earlier. Finally, the Gunblade, and I've touched on the Gunblade before. People have mixed feelings about this ever since Final Fantasy XIII's release, because there's a little competition going on between whether you prefer Squall or Lightnings, I guess. But in terms of its symbolism, I really like the Gunblade, because blending a sword with a gun, it fuses this notion of technology and advancement of the world of Final Fantasy VIII with the antiquated side of things, which is knights and sorceresses and all of that. So I loved all of that, and I think the only thing that players and some people took exception to cosmetically, but also I suppose it's thematic as well, is the significance of Griever. And this is a ring that we get to name when we loan it to Rinoa, so it seemingly has this significance to it. And then it randomly appears again in the final boss fight with Ultimecia. And there's a bit that's lost in translation here, but Griever is intended to be this manifestation of Squall's inner strength and this personification that he has of himself over the years. It's a very interesting concept that's just not really delivered fully, because I think it could lend to the idea about how Guardian forces are manifested into the world and stuff like that. But my understanding is it's very much the Japanese version of the game and the Ultimania that does a little more to add to that. Okay, so there's a bunch more characters that I think we could dive into here. Sid Kramer, I've touched on him a little bit already in terms of his key relevances. Adir, who is also a really interesting red herring sort of character early on. Quite a low-key pivotal character really in the grand scheme of things, because she is the catalyst for the creation of Garden. She is the one who interacts with the time-compressed Squall to learn about the future threat of Ultimecia and all of that. And perhaps above all, she is a really strong visual presence earlier in the game and in the game's marketing at its release to the more archaic witchery and stuff that's going on behind all of this high-tech futurism. So I really do like Adir, but much like Cypher, sadly she kind of peters out as well after the Ultimecia reveal. And personally, I think if they held the player's hand a little bit more, if they made that transition to Ultimecia more gradual, perhaps had Adir as a playable party member for a little bit longer to segue into that, it might have been less of a hard pivot for a lot of players. But that's my impression of Adir at a top level. So the final two characters I want to cover in a bit more detail are Elone and Laguna, because they are mutually incredibly important characters in Final Fantasy VIII. They are basically the backbone of the entire story in a lot of ways, with Elone, despite her sparse and intermittent appearances, being the bridge between past and present, the bridge between Laguna and Squall. She is the sought-after prize of our main antagonist Ultimecia, and indeed the catalyst for Ultimecia's presence in the first place, with the character of Dr. Odin having invented the junction machine Elone from his research into Elone's brainwaves. Now, I touched on this already, and fundamentally I am on board with Elone's inclusion in the game. I think she's fascinating, and I really like the concept of having this elusive girl who is perpetually in hiding and dotted throughout the story. It adds a layer of mystery and intrigue there. We see her at the beginning of the game in the infirmary. We save her from the training centre a bit later on, so there is this consistent reminder that something else is going on here, a puzzle piece to fall into place. Her inclusion in the Laguna dreams likewise escalate all the way up to the Esthar scenario, eventually bridging these two halves of the story. So Elone is a super important character, and one of an ensemble of important characters if we look at everyone who's impacted this story, whether it's Adir, Julia, Laguna, so on. But the only thing that really irks me about Elone, and I say this as someone that is generally on board with things being left ambiguous or unsaid, is that there is no real context or even a nod or a hint about the source of her powers. And I'm not suggesting it needed to be explained outright or anything like that, but for a game that pretty much rests entirely on Elone's power having taken place, there should have been something, I think. Is she somehow tied biologically to the sorceresses, or the mythical Great Hind, or even the Guardian forces to account for her powers? We simply don't know, and for a game that, despite its narrative complexity, has such consistent and interesting source material in basically all areas, whether that's the sorceresses being the descendants of Hind and all of that sort of thing, it does really bug me that Elone can junction people because reasons, and that's it. So if I had to give one criticism of Final Fantasy VIII that really does actually irk me, it's that. Moving on to Laguna, he is the adverse of Elone in this regard. I think his dream sequences are fantastically written and paced throughout the present-day story to allude to the historical context of the game, why things are the way they are, on almost every level, whether that's personal characters and character arcs to geopolitical events. We see everything shaped by what transpires in the Laguna dreams. And indeed, it's fair to suggest that Laguna has impacted the lives, if inadvertently, of almost every significant character in this game, whether that's Rinoa via her mother Julia, Squall obviously being his son, Cypher Almacy being inspired by the Laguna movie. And even civilizations like the Shumi Moomba, who revere him and built this statue of him, or the people of Esthar, who made him their leader after he disposed of Egill. It's a really interesting ripple effect that Laguna has in his pursuit of rescuing Alone in the distant past. Just touching on Laguna as a deuteragonist, a secondary hero, and someone who is the antithesis of Squall. I also like how, in his own way, he nods to the sort of light-hearted Final Fantasy hero of days gone by, and where Squall has this passing familiarity to characters like Cloud Strife, Laguna is more along the lines of a Bart's Klauser or a Locke Cole in temperament. In some ways, Final Fantasy VIII is seeking to strike this balance between old and new, and the subtle symbolism between kind of past and present heroes. We have the severity and the dramatic fated hero of Squall, and this chancing everyman type of protagonist of Laguna. And again, just looking at the symbolism of their respective weapons here, Squall wields a sword, or sword-like weapon, which is, this famous kind of serious hero weapon throughout history and mythology, while Laguna wields a machine gun, which is a much more common, more everyman sort of standard issue armament, rather than anything that's overly symbolic or fated. But that being said, it's not to say that Laguna is all light-hearted and humour. There is a certain bittersweetness to his story too. There's a sense of the passing of time, the roads not taken, the loss of both Julia and Rain, the latter of which is memorialised in his ending vignette, which is great. And even when Kiros meets him in Windhill, in the second Laguna Dream, or third Laguna Dream, sorry, he seems to be suggesting that Laguna is wasting his time. What's he really doing with himself? So all of this speaks to the choices that we make in life, and regrets that we inevitably live with to some degree or another, about paths not taken. And this is glimpsed throughout the Laguna arc, I think, particularly when we meet him in Esthar, and it ultimately reconciles with the broader idea of time that I keep touching on. So for me and those that love Laguna, it is precisely these reasons that we think he's great, I think. He has this chemistry and comedy with Kiros and Ward as chancers and opportunists in life, which is a great break from the central story, while at the same time he has this undertone of sincerity and sadness too. A really great character here, and a strong case for being a central, perhaps the hero in Final Fantasy VIII. Some people argue that he is. Moving on from the characters and how they contribute to the game, I'd like to field some of the criticisms now that are often levelled at Final Fantasy VIII, at least some of the more common ones. Now, as I say, I personally forgive the game quite a lot. I think the positives and the emotive story far outweighs these elements that are perhaps a little bit janky or had issues in terms of clarity or translation. But there are nonetheless aspects of the story that are less popular. Firstly, we have the infamous basketball sequence. This is where our party members meet at the now destroyed Trebia Garden, and we get a grand reveal about their collective past. Now, one thing that I do like in this scene, and for years I thought I was going mad until I actually saw it in a forum, but Irvine can score with the basketball that he throws at the net, depending on how many battles that we've won, which is quite a fun little variable that the game offers there. But aside from that, most things about this scene are generally criticised for the highly improbable convenience of our characters ending up all together in the way they do. So, just to recap, Irvine mentions growing up in an orphanage by a lighthouse by the sea. This gradually rekindles everyone else's memories in our party, apart from Renoa, that they did also grow up in an orphanage by the sea. And they each gradually piece together this childhood story they recall of letting off fireworks as children down on the beach. So their bewilderment about forgetting this is theorised to be because of the Guardian forces, which are often rumoured to cause amnesia. So this reveal requires a suspension of disbelief that 5 characters, plus Cypher, have grown up together, gone their separate ways before reconciling in the same place, same time, through happenstance for these seed missions. I think the amnesia on top of that, where Squall has presumably gone through his entire schooling without acknowledging Zell or Cypher or Quistis from his childhood. Although personally I find that less critical. I've mentioned in the past how certain people in my life become part of the furniture, which is to say, I've had friends that I've known for over 20 years. I couldn't tell you how I met them. So I find that Squall sort of forgetting people, or not necessarily forgetting people, but just accepting that Zell and Quistis are around, and they always have been. I think that's more forgivable than perhaps the rest of this scenario. But combined with that, we have the way this is revealed by Irvine in a very curveball, impromptu scene. It's very criticised by players, more generally than not. For my part, I go back and forth on it. I think accepting Final Fantasy VIII as a story of fate, which it very much is, one could perhaps roll with this curveball a little bit more. I also think it shows another side to Irvine, who is otherwise just this amorous idiot, so it's also good that we see another perspective of him finally. And what I would say is with the Guardian Forces, it does give them a certain edge that I quite like, although it isn't thoroughly explained enough in this game. It's the first time in a Final Fantasy where the summons aren't necessarily wholly a good thing or a positive, helpful thing, but there is a cost to using them, which I quite like. This is something that's echoed much later on in Final Fantasy XV and some of these other games where they're slightly more dubious, maybe 16 as well. And if they had done a little bit more to explain or explore or emphasise these conflicting philosophies around junctioning, around Guardian Forces, the fact that Balam Garden is the only one that sanctions their use, probably because of Norg, something like that. He is slightly less scrupulous with that stuff. I think that would be a great way to sort of embellish this story. And there is little pockets of information about the Guardian Forces, in the Balam Garden computer and stuff like that, but just doesn't really set it up enough for this reveal to have taken place the way it does at Trabia. In keeping with why this reveal feels so sudden as it does, I think it also relates back to the cuts and the narrative changes from the original draft that happened during FF8's production. So I've mentioned already how the orphanage was originally annotated as a location of Squall and Cypher's memories specifically, and what seems to have happened is somewhere down the line, for whatever reason, the writers felt that the entire party should have resided here instead of just Squall and Cypher. So maybe that's to emphasise the themes that we've covered here. Maybe it was to form a sort of tighter support network around Squall or something like that. They've all come from the same place perhaps. Or maybe to give these playable party members personal histories that are quite quick and convenient to reconcile instead of breaking out into these personal story arcs that most Final Fantasies do to some degree or another with the playable party. Or maybe simply it was because the writers found that they couldn't pay off this historic childhood feud between Squall and Cypher the way they wanted to, because of course he drops off after Disc 2. So what they did is they broadened the childhood arc to feature everyone, so that it kind of carries through towards the end a little bit more through the playable party. I'm not really sure, I'm just spitballing and I suppose making excuses for the writing here, but the final delivery, it was definitely sudden and it definitely had that whiff of rushed writing about it. So I think the upshot is, does the comparative warmth and reconciliation of this moment between these childhood pseudo-siblings and the sense of fatedness, does it outweigh the jankiness of the writing for you, the player? So for me, I do forgive it. A lot of people don't. Moving on, and in keeping with the Guardian Forces lore, as mentioned, the only official sources of magic in this world come from Guardian Forces as this conduit and sorceresses, with Dr. Odin developing, or at least researching, the phenomena of paramagic, which allows humans to wield it and junction it. So the prevailing logic that only those with Guardian Forces junctioned can wield magic creates a certain paradox in places when we look at the combat and certain enemies here. For example, we see Cypher Almasy and also the Galbadian soldiers wielding the element of fire without seeming to have GFs equipped. Now, I think this is less of an error than it is a lack of in-game clarity around how paramagic can be used exclusively from Guardian Forces, since the Galbadians have a system of junctioning magic through their weapons, and it's almost like a materia slot sort of system that they have with their weapons that Dr. Odin has developed. It simply isn't contextualized at all in the game, so it can seem a bit janky. For Cypher's part, the info panel confirms in the game that he uses a magic adjacent power called Chi, which he harnesses himself and is sort of like a a skill set that he's developed. And it's another testament, I think, to his fortitude as a character, that again, we simply didn't see referenced or given much context throughout the main story of the game. Looking to other major criticisms, I've already covered junctioning and enemy scaling when I was talking about the mechanics, so I will move on to a final bit that involves gameplay, which is an example of Final Fantasy VIII's novel approach to player attentiveness in terms of storytelling and what to do and where to go. But much like the player being given vague directions and having to find things for themselves, we have the White Seed ship scenario, which is probably the most egregious example of players needing to figure stuff out for themselves. The reason being is that not only is the White Seed ship quite hidden and difficult to find in this little alcove that it's in, but its appearance is dependent on an event trigger, which we have to activate after we are told to go and find the White Seed ship. We're on the bridge in Garden, we are told we need to go and find the White Seed ship, but the player, of their own volition, needs to go and check on Rinoa in the infirmary, without being prompted to, for the White Seed ship to appear on the overworld. That's a really janky way of doing things, because you're told to do one thing, but actually you need to go and do this other little thing first. Now, I raised this in an episode that I did focusing on this White Seed ship scenario, and I was perhaps rightly criticised by certain comments who said, who wouldn't go back and check on their girlfriend? Who wouldn't go and check on Rinoa because she slipped into a coma and we haven't seen her yet? And I do take that's fair enough. And I did do that as a child as well, because I only encountered this issue comparatively recent in more recent playthroughs. And I think it's because you become so familiar with the touch points of the story that actually, you forget about these little idiosyncrasies and little bits you have to do first. So I do tend to overlook it on subsequent playthroughs and think I need to go and find the ship. And again, the vague directions on top of that make it quite a frustrating thing to encounter. So finally, let's focus on the future of Final Fantasy VIII as an IP and as a part of the Final Fantasy anthology. And looping back to consider these past and present opinions of Final Fantasy VIII, the interesting ambiguities of its story that we've sort of covered here, and how that translates into a future game perhaps. Now, there have been a vocal minority of players for years now that have been crying out for a Final Fantasy VIII remake, or a Final Fantasy VIII sequel, or a Final Fantasy VIII prequel. And I think that's a testament really to this stuff that we've discussed here. You can pull this game in any direction, and there's just so much in the source material that you can really have an extended story in any direction with it. So for a remake, a one-to-one remake, you've got all of these ambiguous anomalies like the Guardian Forces and memory loss, or Dr. Odine's inventions, or the histories of our characters that could be expanded on. With a prequel, you could reasonably look more thoroughly into the Laguna story and his adventures, and with a sequel, you can see what becomes of the Galbadians after the Sorceress is gone, what becomes of Esthar after the Lunar Cry, what becomes of Rinoa as a sorceress, not to mention all of this backstory stuff around Great Hine, Alone, the Sorceresses, and all of those bits I've covered. And actually, for anyone interested in theory crafting and sort of fan fiction, I suppose, I do have an episode looking at a hypothetical sequel for Final Fantasy VIII, which includes all of these little disparate elements and tries wrapping them up. So there is a lot of interesting stuff in Final Fantasy VIII that could be developed and capitalised upon. It could easily be a trilogy if one wanted to account for the past, present and future events that we glimpse in the original. And I think the real question is whether there is the political will or the financial backing for Square Enix to actually embark upon it. The personnel that worked on Final Fantasy VIII have long since distanced themselves from any sort of project. And in any case, all of them are starting to inch into their 60s now. I highly doubt they would want to embark on something as comprehensive and complex as a Final Fantasy VIII project. So it would be dependent on a younger team working either autonomously or with some sort of producer level or executive level oversight if any legacy staff were to be involved. I would say the comparative silence around the 25th anniversary of Final Fantasy VIII doesn't offer much encouragement that Square is thinking about this at all, or even paying attention to this title within the oeuvre of Final Fantasy games. So I'm against wishful thinking, and I would expect to see Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy IV or something like that to get the full remake treatment before something like a Final Fantasy VIII if they were really going to sort of go down this road of remake IPs. And finally, there's been several suggestions from players that all they really need to do to make Final Fantasy VIII Remake a success is remove the junction system. But as I've already covered here, I think part of the core issue that they have is that the junction system is basically the fundamental mechanical and narrative driver of Final Fantasy VIII's story. It is Alone's power. It's how we equip and utilise magic in this world. So Final Fantasy VIII's mechanics aren't something that can just be switched out for something else. And really you need to look to make these mechanics work in simply an updated, considerably tweaked way. So for my part, I would personally love to see something new for Final Fantasy VIII. As always, there is a worry that it might get screwed up, but my opinion towards that is you've always got the original game anyway. It's ever since they announced the Final Fantasy VII compilation, that's been my perspective on things. You've got the original, so you can take or leave the new versions if you don't like them. And yeah, you know, and there's various sort of implications that come with modernising the game. Like voice acting is one such thing, which has always been the case ever since they've started modernising the Final Fantasy VII games. There's been conversations around voice acting. Even with what they've done with Final Fantasy VIII, how it's appeared in other media. I mean, for my part, I've always preferred David Boreanaz for Squall's voice. He was the guy that voiced him in Kingdom Hearts 1. I can't even picture how Zell or Irvine would sound, but more so I think my concern around any sort of remake project would be developing and clarifying the things that benefit from developing and clarifying while leaving those things alone that don't. So I can happily play a version of Final Fantasy VIII that doesn't have Squall and Laguna having an I am your father moment. I don't think the game needs that at all. And leaving certain things to this suggestive dialogue and the Timbermaniacs magazines and all of that sort of thing, that's the balance I think they need to strike. Sort of what would help it retain its integrity if you were to go with a remake would be allowing the mysteries to remain there and letting the players do the work to find out certain things in the world. But as I say, at the time of recording, at least, it certainly seems like wishful thinking that we'd get anything more out of Final Fantasy VIII from Square Enix. So I think the only things that I haven't really gone into detail with here is firstly the music and secondly the side quests and supplementary material. So just to cap off on those, I think Nobuo Uematsu's score is fantastic here. I noted earlier how it leans towards a more breezy, optimistic energy compared to some of the earlier games. I suppose the only melancholic tracks I can actually think of are the dungeon pieces like Find Your Way, which isn't wholly negative. It simply conveys a sort of daunting mystery and magical unknown about it. So it really ties in with the more antiquated locations like the Fire Cave or the Tomb of the Unknown King, where we are trying to acquire these mystical guardian forces with Aetheriet and brothers, for example. Beyond that, we have these grand set-piece sort of themes. So for the first time, we have these really one-off cinematic sort of tracks. Libari Fatali, The Landing, Waltz for the Moon are prime examples of that style of music playing out very cinematically with these FMVs. And several pieces, such as The Landing and Libari Fatali, they repeat certain musical motifs throughout the game. And I really like that because it plays into this sense of fate and these elements, these moments being tied together towards a grander fated whole. But as always, I think the real genius of Uematsu comes through in the pieces that are designed basically to be video game music, which is to say they will just repeat endlessly until we complete a certain scenario or leave a location. And it's here where we have pieces like Blue Fields, the world map music, Balam Garden, and my personal favourite, which is the slightly more action-centric, militaristic, The Stage is Set, which really speaks to the mercenary missions and the stuff we're gearing up for. So these are the sorts of scores that really elevate Final Fantasy VIII, and even those that don't particularly like the game, they do tend to concede that the score here was a pretty big achievement. Regarding the side quests, I won't labour on these. I love how this game is tied together both narratively and mechanically, and the side quests really work in service of that and extend that. So whether it's the card games or unlocking all of the Guardian forces, they loop back. They're in this ecosystem of feeding back into improving our character builds and stuff like that, unlocking rare items, all of that sort of thing. And a prime example is how the character cards can refine into some of the rarest items in the game, giving a real tangible use for them once we've acquired them. And this is the main difference and the main letdown, I think, of Queen's Blood in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And don't get me wrong, I love Queen's Blood. I think the gameplay of that card game was great. I really enjoy it. It's simply that there was no real payoff or tangible reward from playing through Queen's Blood. There's nothing that really moves the dial or we get for our characters, whether it's a cool weapon or a rare item or whatever, by beating it. So Triple Triad was excellent in that regard. We also have more obscure bits like the alien poo-poo encounters or the Obel Lake mystery, the magazines such as Combat King, Weapons Monthly, and Timber Maniacs. And each of these contribute in their own way to encourage exploration and engagement with the overall game. So there we have it, a slightly more comprehensive look at Final Fantasy VIII, which I've opted to revisit since it's been over 10 years since my original review. I've tried here to unify my thoughts that have periodically been dropped in standalone episodes looking at specific mechanics or narrative aspects of FF8 over the years. It's a game that continues to impress me with its ceaseless mysteries and intrigues that came about as much by haste and happenstance in its production as by design, which, frankly, I love.